Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that touches every single one of us, every single morning, whether we want it to or not. Breakfast cereal. Yes, that innocent little box sitting in your cabinet right now. The one with the cartoon mascot and the suspiciously cheerful colour palette has a history so bizarre, so deeply strange, so tangled up in religion, sex panic, and institutionalised bowel obsession that you're going to feel very differently about your morning bowl of cornflakes by the end of this. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a huge, sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and I want you to know that this one is genuinely one of the most unhinged rabbit holes we've gone down together. Your suggestions are what make this channel feel like something real, something built together, not just me talking into the dark, and I mean that. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that oddly comforting. Oh, and if you're a Spotify person, we're over there too, link is in the description. Now dim those lights, put on a fan, pull that blanket up to your chin, and just let your body go heavy. You don't need to do anything right now except exist and listen. But first, have you ever actually wondered why cereal exists? Like who looked at a grain of wheat and thought, you know what this needs? To be flattened, toasted, and eaten with cold milk at 7 a.m. by a half-asleep adult in their pyjamas. Why does every box have a mascot? Why does one famous cereal exist specifically because a man believed it would stop people from having impure thoughts? Why were the first people to eat this stuff patients at a medical sanatorium who had no say in the matter? Were there really cereal billionaires? Did a single family from a small Michigan town accidentally invent an entire food industry that still, to this day, controls what 200 million Americans put in their mouths before they're fully awake? And the real question, the one that should be keeping you up at night is, did it work? Did cereal actually make anyone healthier, holier, or less interested in sin? Congratulations. You have just woken up in Battle Creek, Michigan. The year is 1894. You smell like institutional soap. There's a man in a white coat watching you chew. And somewhere nearby, a very determined doctor is absolutely convinced that your breakfast is a moral issue. Good luck. Before there was cereal, there was a catastrophe happening in American kitchens every single morning, and nobody had a name for it yet. You wake up in 1875 America, and breakfast is a slab of salted pork, a hunk of bread fried in lard, maybe a brick of cheese, and coffee strong enough to strip paint off a barn door. You eat this while standing, because sitting is for people with time, and then you go do 14 hours of physical labour and wonder why your stomach hates you. The American digestive system, doctors of the era were beginning to agree, was in a state of complete and total revolt. Dyspepsia, which was the Victorian word for a rolling, miserable catch-all stomach disorder that included indigestion, bloating, fatigue, anxiety, and general existential suffering, was being called a national epidemic. This was the crisis that breakfast cereal was invented to solve. It wasn't about convenience, it wasn't about flavour, and it certainly wasn't about Tony the Tiger. It was about a country whose collective gut had simply had enough. The average American in the post-Civil War era was not eating thoughtfully. Industrialization had pulled people off farms and into cities, where food was whatever you could find quickly, afford cheaply, and swallow fast enough to get to work on time. The idea of a considered, balanced morning meal was a luxury available to people who weren't rushing to a factory floor by 6 a.m. Everyone else made do. And making do, in the 1870s, meant a lot of heavy animal protein, a lot of refined white flour, a lot of preserved meat that had been sitting in brine long enough to constitute a geological event, and almost no fresh vegetables because fresh vegetables were seasonal, expensive, and didn't keep. You ate what survived winter. Winter was not kind to anything green. The consequences were predictable and widespread. Doctors across the country were seeing patients with overlapping constellations of symptoms: chronic indigestion, fatigue, headaches, irritability, what one physician described memorably as a general feeling of being wrong in the body. The diagnosis was almost always dyspepsia, a word capacious enough to contain almost any complaint that originated somewhere between the throat and the lower abdomen. It was the 19th century's version of a catch-all wellness diagnosis, the chronic fatigue syndrome of its era, real, uncomfortable, genuinely debilitating for many sufferers, and also occasionally a polite medical term for the fact that you had been eating lard for 30 years. Here's the modern comparison that might land hardest. Think about the current cultural conversation around gut health, the probiotics, the fiber supplements, the sourdough renaissance, the entire podcast industry devoted to the microbiome. America's relationship with its own digestive system has never really changed. We have just updated the vocabulary. In the 1870s, they called it dyspepsia and blamed dense meat. Today, we call it inflammation and blame gluten. The anxious preoccupation with what breakfast is doing to your insides is, it turns out, not a modern phenomenon. It is a persistent American tradition with a paper trail going back to before your great-great-grandmother was born. Into this landscape of digestive misery and dietary confusion walked a series of reformers, visionaries, and in at least one case, a man with opinions so comprehensive and so forcefully held that they would eventually reshape what 200 million people put in a bowl every morning. They had theories, they had institutions, they had in some cases fairly extraordinary ideas about the relationship between what you ate and who you were as a moral being. They also, it must be said, had a lot of thoughts about your bowels. We'll get to all of that. But first, let's talk about the man who built the stage on which this entire drama would play out. If you want to understand why cereal exists, you have to understand John Harvey Kellogg, and once you do, you will never look at a box of cornflakes the same way again. Kellogg was a physician, a prolific author, a tireless reformer, and a man of such profound, comprehensive, and deeply personal opinions about the human body that historians still argue about how to categorize him. He believed that diet, digestion, and moral character were not separate concerns. They were one single unified system. A clean bowel and a virtuous life were, in his view, essentially the same project. He ran the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, a sprawling medical resort where wealthy Americans came to be healed through diet, exercise, fresh air, cold water, and a daily routine so rigidly optimized it made military boot camp look casual. He was also, it must be said, almost certainly the most opinionated man in any room he ever entered, which was saying something in an era full of extremely opinionated men. Kellogg was born in 1852 in Tyrone, Michigan, the son of a Seventh-day Adventist broom manufacturer, which is exactly the origin story you'd expect for someone who grew up to make dietary extremism his life's work. He was a prodigy, serious, driven, and apparently impossible to argue with from a very early age. He trained as a physician in New York and at Bellevue Hospital, which was a legitimate, rigorous medical education for its time. He was not a quack in the sense of having no training. He was a fully qualified doctor who then took that training and used it to construct an extremely elaborate personal ideology about food, bodies, and the proper management of both, he wrote prolifically. Over the course of his career, he produced 39 books, which is an output that suggests either extraordinary discipline or a complete inability to stop talking. His subjects range from surgical technique to nutrition to the dangers of various personal habits, and he covered all of them with the same tone, the tone of a man who has thought about this more than you have and would like you to understand the stakes. He was a genuine medical innovator in some respects. He was an early advocate for germ theory. promoted the importance of exercise decades before it became mainstream, and performed thousands of surgical procedures with a skill that his contemporaries acknowledged even when they found him difficult. But the thing about Kellogg that made him genuinely extraordinary, and also genuinely alarming, was the totalizing nature of his vision. He did not believe that health was a physical matter separate from moral character. He believed they were the same thing, approached from different angles. A properly fed, properly rested, properly exercised body was also a morally ordered body. An undisciplined body, one allowed to eat stimulating food, to give in to cravings, to take its appetites seriously, was a body sliding toward both physical and spiritual ruin. This was not a fringe position in late Victorian wellness culture, but Kellogg held it with a fervour that went considerably beyond average. If you have ever, at any point in your life, felt vaguely guilty about what you ate for breakfast, you are experiencing from a century's distance the cultural gravity of John Harvey Kellogg's worldview. He did not invent food guilt, but he industrialized it, institutionalized it, and served it in a bowl. He was, in both the best and the most complicated senses of the phrase, a man with a mission. And his mission was your digestion, whether you wanted it to be or not. Picture a grand Victorian building set in the quiet Michigan countryside, all wide porches and manicured lawns, where well-heeled Americans arrived by train carrying leather trunks and intestinal complaints. This was the Battle Creek Sanitarium, known affectionately, or perhaps nervously, as the Sane, and it was unlike anything that had existed in American medicine before. Part hospital, part luxury hotel, part religious institution, part social experiment, the SAN operated under the absolute authority of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who had opinions about literally everything you might do with your body between waking up and going to sleep. Guests were wealthy enough to afford the fees but desperate enough to try almost anything. Industrialists with gout, society women with nervous exhaustion, clergymen with indigestion, all checking in for weeks or months at a time to be rehabilitated according to Kellogg's exacting philosophy. The SAN had hydrotherapy pools, electric light treatments, mechanical vibrating chairs, fresh air pavilions, and a dining room where every single thing you ate had been specifically chosen to accomplish something very particular in your gastrointestinal tract. At its peak, the SAN could accommodate several hundred guests simultaneously, and the waiting list was long. This was not a desperate last resort for people with nowhere else to go. This was, by the standards of the 1880s and 90s, a fashionable destination. Coming to Battle Creek meant you took your health seriously. It meant you had read the right books, knew the right people, and were willing to invest real money in your own physical improvement. The guest list over the decades reads like a strange and eclectic hall of fame. Presidents, inventors, industrialists, celebrities of the era, all submitting themselves to Kellogg's program with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The daily routine was comprehensive in a way that the word comprehensive does not quite capture. You woke early, you exercised, you ate exactly what you were given in the dining room, which was entirely plant-based, carefully prepared, and seasoned with what can most charitably be described as restraint. You underwent whatever treatments Kellogg had prescribed for your specific complaint, which might include being blasted with cold water, sat under ultraviolet light, vibrated mechanically, or subjected to an enema of such dedicated frequency that it became, for many guests, the most memorable feature of their stay. Kellogg was a firm believer in intestinal cleansing. He believed that many of the body's ills originated in the colon, and he treated the colon with the focused attention of a man who had made it his personal project. The dining room deserves its own paragraph. It was elegant. It was well staffed. The food was served attractively, in proper courses, with silverware and linens. because Kellogg understood that if you were going to ask wealthy people to eat things they found disappointing, you should at least present those things beautifully. The meals were nutritionally earnest and gastronomically challenging. Guests who arrived expecting the pleasant food of a country hotel discovered instead a carefully engineered sequence of vegetable preparations, grain dishes, and nut-based proteins, none of which were particularly exciting, all of which were deeply intentional. And in the kitchen, working long hours, managing the experimental grain preparations, handling the correspondence, and generally keeping the whole machinery running, was a young man named Will Keith Kellogg, the doctor's younger brother. He was watching, he was thinking, and he was beginning to have ideas about what you could do with all these grain experiments if you were willing to add a little sugar and think commercially. Those ideas were going to cause a great deal of trouble. But first, the philosophy of the bland. Kellogg's dietary theories were built on a foundation that seems, at first glance, almost reasonable, and then, the longer you look at it, becomes something else entirely. He believed that the digestive system was sacred, a precision instrument that the modern American diet was destroying through stimulation, excess, and a general failure of personal restraint. Spices were dangerous, meat was dangerous. Anything that tasted particularly good was, statistically speaking, probably dangerous. The ideal diet, according to Kellogg, was simple, plain, gentle, and above all unstimulating. His reasoning was partly medical and partly something more ideological. In his framework, a bland diet didn't just soothe the stomach, it soothed the passions. A person eating boiled vegetables and plain grains was, in his view, physiologically less likely to experience urges of the morally inconvenient variety. This was not a fringe position in late Victorian wellness culture. It was, in fact, a fairly mainstream theory with a dedicated following, several published journals, and an entire health movement behind it. It just sounds extraordinary now because we have the benefit of hindsight, flavour, and a general cultural comfort with spices. The philosophical underpinning of Kellogg's bland diet came from a tradition of American dietary reform that stretched back at least to Sylvester Graham, a Presbyterian minister and temperance advocate who had spent the 1830s arguing that white flour, meat, and spices were inflaming the animal instincts of the American population. Graham believed that a coarser, simpler diet, based around whole grain bread, which is why we still have the graham cracker, though it bears almost no resemblance to what he actually had in mind, would produce calmer, more rational, more morally stable citizens. He was not joking. He was also not a doctor. But his ideas found an audience in a country that was perpetually anxious about the relationship between the body's appetites and the soul's discipline. Kellogg took Graham's general framework and built it into something considerably more systematic. He connected dietary stimulation to nervous exhaustion through a theory involving what he called auto-intoxication, the idea that improper digestion allowed toxins to form in the intestine and be absorbed into the bloodstream, where they degraded the nervous system, undermined mental clarity, and contributed to a range of physical and moral deteriorations. This theory is not supported by modern science. At the time, however, it sounded plausible enough to be widely discussed, and it gave Kellogg a coherent medical framework for what was essentially a set of moral preferences dressed up as physiology. The practical result was a diet of genuine bleakness, applied with missionary conviction. Pepper was forbidden at the Sands table, mustard was forbidden, vinegar was forbidden, tea and coffee were forbidden on the grounds of their stimulant properties. Alcohol was forbidden, which was at least in alignment with the broader temperance movement of the era, and therefore easier to sell. Meat was forbidden, which was harder to sell to the industrialists and former beef enthusiasts, who made up a significant portion of the guest list. The meals that emerged from these constraints were nutritionally defensible, and gastronomically inert, which is perhaps the kindest way to put it. What's striking, standing here in the 21st century and looking back, is how directly this philosophy maps onto contemporary wellness culture. Replace auto-intoxication with inflammation. Replace stimulation with cortisol. Replace Kellogg's plain grain preparations with the current enthusiasm for anti-inflammatory eating, or seed oil avoidance, or sugar elimination, and the structure of the argument is remarkably similar. Every era, it seems, produces a version of the theory that your body's problems are caused by something you're enjoying too much. Kellogg's version just happened to come in a bowl before 7 in the morning. The Kellogg family's world was shaped from the beginning by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and to understand the cereal industry, you genuinely have to spend a moment understanding that. The Adventists were a 19th century American Protestant denomination, with strong convictions about health, diet, and the preparation of the body as a spiritual act. They believed that taking care of your physical self was not separate from religious devotion, it was part of it. They were largely vegetarian. They were opposed to alcohol, tobacco, and stimulants of all kinds, and they had a deep institutional investment in finding foods that could sustain their communities without compromising their principles. When the Church opened the Western Health Reform Institute in Battle Creek in 1866, the institution that would eventually become Kellogg's famous SAN, they were looking for foods that could feed patients in a way that aligned with their beliefs. What they were unknowingly looking for, though they didn't know it yet, was something that could be mass-produced, stored, shipped, and eaten with cold milk before you were fully awake. The Adventist connection to American food culture runs deeper than most people realize, and it runs specifically through Battle Creek. The church had made that small Michigan city a headquarters, and the surrounding community of Adventist families provided both the institutional support and the cultural context for everything Kellogg would eventually build. Many of the staff at the SAN were church members. The dietary philosophy was explicitly grounded in Adventist health teaching, which drew in part from the writings of Ellen G. White, the church's co-founder and prophetic voice, who'd received visions specifically related to diet and health, and had communicated them to her followers with a directness and authority that left limited room for negotiation. White's health teachings were, for their time and context, genuinely progressive in certain respects. She advocated vegetarianism decades before it entered mainstream medical conversation. She opposed the use of drugs and patent medicines when those medicines were often more dangerous than the conditions they claimed to treat. She emphasized fresh air, exercise, and rest in an era when the medical establishment was still prescribing arsenic with relative casualness. The Adventist health institution she inspired, of which Battle Creek was only one, eventually grew into a global network of hospitals and sanitariums that still operates today. But the relevant point for cereal is this. The Adventist Church provided Kellogg with an institutional home, a captive patient population, a philosophical framework, and a built-in community of people who were already ideologically committed to the idea that what you ate was a moral question with serious consequences. He did not have to convince his audience from scratch. He was preaching in the most literal sense to the choir, and the choir was already avoiding meat, already suspicious of stimulants, and already looking for grain-based foods that could satisfy without compromising the principles they'd built their lives around. The extraordinary irony, which the Adventist Church has had a complicated relationship with over the years, is that this earnest religious and health reform project accidentally produced one of the most commercially successful food categories in American history, a category that would eventually include products containing so much sugar and artificial colouring that Kellogg himself would have had them confiscated at the SAN's front door. The road from theological conviction to children's cereal with marshmallows is not a straight one, but it is, in its strange and winding way, a continuous one. The Adventists were trying to nourish the soul. They ended up nourishing an industry. History does not always go where you aim it. Before cornflakes, before Rice Krispies, before the entire pastel-coloured cereal aisle as we know it, there were dyspepsia biscuits. That's what they were actually called. You could not invent a less appealing brand name if you tried for a decade. James Caleb Jackson, a health reformer running his own sanitarium in upstate New York in the 1860s, created a product he called granola, a baked, dried and rebaked mixture of graham flour that had to be soaked in milk overnight before it was soft enough to chew. It was, by every available account, not pleasant. It was dense, gritty, time-consuming, and required planning ahead the night before, which is frankly asking a lot of a person who hasn't had coffee yet. Kellogg encountered this concept and adapted it, creating his own version, which he also called granular, until Jackson threatened to sue, at which point Kellogg renamed it granola, a word which has now outlived everyone involved. This was the first commercially produced ready-to-eat grain food in American history, and it was an acquired taste requiring the patience of a saint. To fully appreciate what Jackson had made, you need to sit with the texture for a moment. Granular was not a food you approached casually. It was so hard that eating it without overnight soaking posed a genuine dental risk, which is a remarkable quality in a product being marketed as a health food. The idea was that the baking and rebaking process would make it more digestible than ordinary bread, because the starch would be partially broken down by the heat, a theory that was not entirely without scientific basis, even if the execution produced something you could theoretically use as a doorstop. Jackson distributed granular by mail order from his Our Home on the Hillside Sanitarium in Dansville, New York, which meant that somewhere in America in the 1870s, there were people receiving packages of extremely hard-baked grain through the postal service and soaking them overnight and eating them for breakfast, voluntarily, because they had been convinced this was good for them. They were paying real money for this. The mail-order health food business had been invented, and it looked like a sack of pebbles that required 12 hours of advance preparation. Kellogg's version, granola, was somewhat more accommodating, lighter, less actively aggressive to the teeth, and produced in the Sands kitchen, where it could be modified in response to feedback from the patient population. It sold reasonably well to the Sands guests, and through a small mail-order operation, establishing the earliest commercial model for ready-to-eat grain food. Make it in an institutional kitchen, sell it to health-conscious adults who are already ideologically committed to the project, ship it to people who can't get it locally. The lesson Kellogg took from granola was that the concept had commercial potential, that people would buy grain-based health foods if they were convenient enough and the marketing was compelling enough. What it needed was something more appealing in texture, something you could eat without planning the night before, something that didn't require the willpower of a committed ascetic to get through a bowl of. That something, still a few years off, was going to arrive through an accident involving a forgotten batch of cooked wheat and a pair of kitchen rollers. These things, it turns out, rarely happen on purpose. Here is the part of the story that sounds made up but is completely documented. Cornflakes were invented because someone left cooked wheat sitting out too long. You're eating the product of a mistake. It was 1894, and John Harvey Kellogg and his younger brother Will Keith Kellogg were working in the Sands experimental kitchen, trying to develop new grain-based foods for patients. They cooked a batch of wheat, and then, due to some combination of overwork, distraction, and the general chaos of running a medical institution, they left it sitting out. When they came back to it, the wheat had gone stale and slightly dried out. Most people would have thrown it away. The Kellogg brothers instead ran it through the rollers they used to make dough sheets, and instead of a flat continuous sheet, it broke apart into individual flakes, each one thin and separate. They toasted them, they tasted them, and somewhere in that kitchen in Battle Creek, Michigan, the breakfast cereal as a category of food was born. It was not a eureka moment. It was closer to a shrug and a discovery that stale grain apparently had some potential. The key to the flaking was the staleness. Fresh cooked grain, when run through rollers, produces a continuous sheet of dough, which is not interesting or particularly useful. But grain that has been cooked and then allowed to sit long enough to partially dry develops a different texture. The moisture redistributes unevenly through the kernel, and when that kernel is then rolled under pressure, it separates into individual flakes rather than merging into a sheet. It was a property of stale, rested grain that nobody had previously thought to exploit. The Kellogg's, stumbling into it through inattention, immediately recognized it as something worth pursuing. They refined the process. They experimented with different grains, wheat first, then corn, which proved to have a better flavor profile after toasting and a more consistent flaking behavior. Corn was also cheaper and more abundant in Michigan than wheat, which was not a minor consideration for an institution trying to feed several hundred patients, while also maintaining a commercial mail-order operation. The first cornflakes were not the product you know today. They were thicker, less consistent in size, and had a noticeably different flavour, more grain-forward, less sweet, more genuinely austere. They were served to patients at the San with a glass of cold milk, and the patients apparently ate them without significant complaint, which in the context of the San's general dining experience counted as an enthusiastic endorsement. The patents were filed, the product was refined, and then the mail-order business for the flaked cereals began to grow in a way that neither brother had fully anticipated. People who had been guests at the San returned home and missed the cereals they'd eaten there began writing to ask if they could have them sent. Word spread through the networks of health reform enthusiasts, Adventist communities, and the broader population of Americans who were looking for an alternative to the morning slab of pork and had the disposable income to try something new. What nobody involved in that kitchen in Battle Creek quite grasped yet was that they had not merely invented a new food. They had accidentally invented a new category, a new way of being in relationship with grain, with breakfast, and with the morning ritual itself. They had made something that you could make in a factory, put in a box, ship anywhere, sell to anyone, and eat without cooking, without planning, and without a functioning digestive system willing to process salted pork at 6 a.m. That was, commercially speaking, not a small thing. WK understood this. John Harvey characteristically had other priorities. Specifically, he had opinions about sugar. There are two Kellogg's in this story, and they could not have been more different people if they had tried. John Harvey Kellogg was a visionary, a zealot, a man who wrote 39 books and never once in his life thought small. Will Keith Kellogg, WK, as he was known, was the younger brother who ran the business, managed the kitchen, kept the institution functioning, handled the correspondence, and spent years watching his famous brother take credit for things they had developed together. WK understood something his brother did not, or perhaps simply did not care about. People would only eat something healthy if it tasted good enough to want. He wanted to add sugar to the flakes. John Harvey was appalled. Sugar was a stimulant. Sugar was a moral hazard. Sugar was the enemy. The disagreement between the brothers over this single question, whether to sweeten the cereal, would eventually tear their relationship apart, produce one of the most successful food businesses in American history, and also generate a lawsuit that lasted for years and was deeply unpleasant for everyone involved. WK had spent roughly 2 decades as his brother's employee before the cereal business gave him a reason to strike out on his own. He was paid poorly, credited rarely, and worked in a role that was simultaneously indispensable and invisible. John Harvey Kellogg was the face of the San, the author, the physician, the man whose name appeared on the books and the letterhead. WK was the man who made sure the laundry was done, the kitchen was staffed, the mail orders were fulfilled, and the day-to-day operation of a facility housing hundreds of patients ran without visible seams. It was the kind of job that requires tremendous competence and produces almost no recognition, and WK did it for years with a quiet, building frustration that comes through clearly in the historical record. When the cereal mail-order business began to grow, WK was the one who understood its potential in purely commercial terms. He saw that the flaked cereals were reaching people who had never been to the SAN, people who were not health reform enthusiasts or Adventist church members, people who were simply looking for something easy and edible to eat in the morning. He saw that the market was not a niche, it was enormous. He also saw, with the clarity of someone who had spent years in a kitchen listening to feedback, that the product needed to taste better if it was going to compete for shelf space against pork and eggs in households that had no ideological investment in digestive health. The sugar question was not simply about flavour. For WK, it was about whether the cereal business was going to remain a health food operation serving a committed minority or become something genuinely mass market. He knew which of those two futures was commercially significant. He chose accordingly, quietly experimenting with malt flavouring and small additions of sugar in the early 1900s, before formally launching the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company in 1906. He put his own signature on the box, a small, slightly defiant gesture of ownership, and began advertising aggressively. His brother sued him. The lawsuit was bitter and exhausting and aired grievances that had been accumulating for 2 decades. WK eventually won, kept the Kellogg name, and built one of the most recognizable food companies in the world. John Harvey eventually largely lost the argument about sugar, and the rest of us have been eating sweet cereal ever since. Charles William Post arrived at the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1891 as a patient, which was a thing that was about to become extremely ironic. He was exhausted, dyspeptic, suffering from what his doctors described as a general nervous collapse, and he checked in hoping to be cured by Dr. Kellogg's methods. He was not, as it turned out, cured, or at least not by Kellogg. He recovered under the separate care of a Christian Science practitioner named Elizabeth Gregory, and then, with the health philosophy still fresh in his mind and the business model of the SAN right in front of him, he decided to go into the health food business himself. He opened a small boarding house in Battle Creek for people who couldn't afford the SAN. He began experimenting with grain products in a small barn, and in 1895 he introduced a product called Postum, a grain-based hot beverage designed as a coffee substitute, marketed on the radical promise that it would not destroy your nerves, which was more than could be said for your morning cup. Post had watched Kellogg build a philosophy and a reputation. He was now going to take that philosophy and apply aggressive, inventive, utterly relentless marketing to it. Post was not a food scientist. He was not a physician. He was a salesman, a promoter, a man who understood with unusual clarity that in a marketplace full of anxious people, the most valuable thing you could sell was certainty, the confident assurance that this product, this specific thing in this specific box, would solve the problem you'd been walking around with for years. Kellogg sold health through authority, through the weight of his medical credentials and the grandeur of his institution. Post sold it through advertising, through the simple direct promise of the newspaper ad, through language that landed in people's hands at breakfast time and told them exactly what they wanted to hear. Postum was built on the premise that coffee was ruining American health. Post called coffee a drug, pointed to its effect on the nervous system, and positioned Postum as the sane, rational alternative for people who wanted to start their morning without introducing a chemical stimulant into their bloodstream before their eyes were fully open. This argument resonated in a culture already primed by Kellogg and the broader health reform movement to be suspicious of anything that felt too good. Postum sold extraordinarily well, not because it tasted particularly like coffee, which it did not, but because the marketing was so effective that people convinced themselves the taste was acceptable in exchange for the health benefits Post was promising. The money from Postum funded the next step. Post turned to solid food, to ready-to-eat grain products, to the category that Kellogg had pioneered. He was not interested in sharing it. He was interested in winning it. And he brought to the competition something that the more philosophically preoccupied Kellogg was constitutionally less equipped to deploy: a willingness to say absolutely anything in a newspaper advertisement with total confidence, and then say it again louder. The cereal war was beginning, and it was going to be fought primarily on the pages of the country's newspapers at a volume that would astonish anyone who thought health food was a quiet business. In 1898, C.W. Post introduced grape nuts, and if you have ever wondered why they are called that, given that they contain neither grapes nor nuts, you are asking exactly the right question. Post claimed that grape sugar, which he meant glucose formed during the baking process, was present in the product, and that the small dense nuggets resembled grape seeds, which were sometimes called nuts. This explanation is technically a reach, and practically a masterpiece of early American marketing logic. Grape nuts were marketed not as a breakfast food, but as a health product, a brain food, a remedy for malaria, loose appendix and consumption of the appendix, which are not real medical conditions, and also for consumption, which is what people call tuberculosis, which is extremely real and not treatable with cereal. Post's advertising was magnificent, unhinged, and almost completely unregulated. He made claims that would today result in immediate legal action, and he made them in large print, in national newspapers, with tremendous confidence and no apparent hesitation. The product itself was genuinely unusual. Grape nuts were baked twice, at low temperature for an extended period, which drove out virtually all the moisture and produced a nugget of such extraordinary density that the question of whether you were eating a food or a small piece of compressed matter was, depending on your dental situation, not entirely academic. They were designed to be eaten with milk, which softened them to a consistency that most people found acceptable, and some people found genuinely enjoyable, particularly those who'd grown up eating granular, and therefore had a high tolerance for the harder end of the textural spectrum. Post's advertising for grape nuts was a separate achievement from the product itself, and in some ways the more significant one. He wrote much of it himself, in a voice that combined the earnest authority of a physician, which he was not with the evangelistic energy of a revivalist preacher, which culturally speaking he sort of was. He told readers that grape nuts built red blood. He told them it strengthened the nerves. He ran a campaign with the headline "It makes red blood," which is the kind of claim that raises immediate questions, primarily the question of what the alternative might be and whether you should be worried about it. He attributed recoveries from serious illnesses to the product. He published testimonials from grateful consumers with the selectivity of a man who was under no regulatory obligation to include the disappointed ones. What Post understood, and what his advertising demonstrated with remarkable clarity, was that the anxious American health consumer of the 1890s and 1900s was not primarily motivated by taste or convenience or price. They were motivated by fear, the fear of disease, of nervous collapse, of the body's betrayal, and by the corresponding hope that there existed a simple intervention, a daily practice, a thing you could eat in the morning that would hold that fear at bay. Post's genius was in understanding that this was not a medical market. It was an emotional one, and he wrote to the emotions with the precision of a man who had once sat in that very chair himself, sick and frightened and desperate for someone to tell him what to do. He had been the customer. He knew exactly what the customer needed to hear. Before C.W. Post, the idea that a food product could be advertised to the general public with slogans, health claims, and emotional language was not a standard commercial practice. Post changed this. He spent unprecedented amounts of money on newspaper advertising at a time when most food companies relied on word of mouth, trade relationships, and the general assumption that if the food was edible, people would find it eventually. He wrote the ads himself. He made dramatic, specific, emotionally resonant promises. Grape nuts, he claimed in one famous campaign, could restore lost reason. It makes red blood, he wrote. It feeds the brain. There was no scientific basis for any of this, and also it did not matter, because people were desperately anxious about their health, their nerves, their productivity, and their digestion. And here was a small brown box promising to fix all of it for a very reasonable price. The modern cereal box, with its health claims, its lifestyle imagery, its promise of transformation by breakfast, is Post's invention as much as anyone's. To appreciate how unusual Post's approach was, you have to understand the advertising landscape he was operating in. In the 1890s, newspaper ads were largely text-heavy announcements, dry, factual, formatted like classified listings. A merchant had goods. The goods were available. Here was the price. That was the convention. Post ignored it entirely. His ads were narratives. They had protagonists. They had problems that needed solving and products that solved them. They had the structure of a story rather than the structure of an inventory notice. And that structural shift, from announcement to narrative, from information to emotion, is the foundational move of modern advertising. Post did not invent it from nothing. Patent medicine advertisers had been using emotional language for decades, but he applied it to a legitimate food product with a consistency and a scale that had no real precedent. He understood the power of the repeated claim. If you told someone once that grape nuts restored lost reason, they might be skeptical. If you told them in every major newspaper in the country, every week for several years running, something interesting happened to the claim. It started to feel familiar. Familiar things feel true. Truth, in a consumer market, is at least partially a function of how many times you have heard something without it being contradicted. Post was not wrong about this. He was simply, by contemporary standards, operating without a net. The mechanics of his campaigns were also innovative in practical terms. He used large display ads at a time when most advertisers bought small column inches. He varied the copy, the actual text of the ads, frequently enough to maintain interest while keeping the core claims consistent. He solicited and published testimonials, understanding that a customer endorsement carried emotional weight that a manufacturer's claim did not, regardless of how selectively those endorsements had been curated. He ran campaigns with themes, with characters, with ongoing narratives that rewarded readers who followed them across multiple issues of a newspaper. He was, in the vocabulary of a century later, doing content marketing in 1898. The result was that grape nuts, a product with a confusing name, an unconventional texture, and health claims that would not survive 30 seconds of contemporary regulatory review, became a genuinely mass-market success. And the broader lesson that a grain-based breakfast product could be sold to a national audience through aggressive, emotionally resonant advertising rather than through physician recommendation or health institution endorsement was not lost on anyone watching. The cereal industry as we know it is Post's industry as much as Kellogg's. Kellogg invented the product. Post invented the way the product would be sold for the next 130 years. The distinction matters, and it is not entirely flattering to either of them. What happened to Battle Creek, Michigan between 1895 and 1905 is one of the stranger economic events in American food history. Word spread about the money being made in grain-based breakfast foods. Entrepreneurs, speculators, former patients of the SAN, random hopeful business people from across the country began arriving in Battle Creek to start their own cereal companies. At the peak of the boom, there were more than 40 cereal companies operating simultaneously in a single mid-sized Michigan town. The streets reportedly smelled of toasting grain. People were mortgaging their houses to fund flake-related ventures. The newspapers called it the Cereal City and covered the boom with the same barely contained excitement they'd give to a gold rush, which in a sense it was, except the gold was extremely flat and best eaten before it got soggy. Most of these companies failed. Some lasted a few months. A handful of them made fortunes before the market corrected. And out of the chaos, a few names survived long enough to become the brands you recognize today. The logic that drove entrepreneurs to Battle Creek was simple and, in isolation, reasonable. Kellogg and Post had demonstrated that people would pay money for grain-based breakfast products. The manufacturing process was not complex. You needed grain, heat, rollers, and packaging, none of which required specialized knowledge that wasn't available to a reasonably determined person with startup capital. The health food market was growing. Consumer interest was clearly there, and Battle Creek had the infrastructure, the supplier relationships, and the reputation of being the place where this industry had been born. If you were going to start a cereal company in 1900, it felt like the logical place to do it. What the entrepreneurs arriving in Battle Creek did not fully reckon with was that having a product was not the same as having a business. Post had demonstrated this with uncomfortable clarity. The product itself mattered far less than the marketing. A tolerable cereal with brilliant advertising would outsell a superior cereal with modest advertising every time. And most of the 40-plus companies that set up operations in Battle Creek in those years had products that ranged from acceptable to genuinely questionable, paired with marketing budgets that could not compete with Post's newspaper campaigns or Kellogg's institutional reputation. They had the grain. They didn't have the story. And without the story, the grain was just grain. The product names from this era deserve a moment of appreciation in their own right. Among the cereals produced in Battle Creek during the boom years were products called Triabeta, Flakota, Malt Ho, Norca, Grain O, Cero Fruito, and, perhaps most ambitiously, Perfo, which was short for perfect food, and did not survive long enough to demonstrate whether that claim had any basis. These names share a particular late Victorian wellness aesthetic. The compressed syllables, the implied scientific authority, the suggestion of nutritional completeness that reads today as a kind of archaeological stratum in the history of health food marketing. Every era produces its own version of this. Ours has just found different syllables. The boom collapsed as booms do, through the combined pressure of market saturation, consumer skepticism, and the inability of most small operators to maintain quality and distribution at a commercially viable scale. By 1910 or so, the field had narrowed dramatically. Battle Creek retained its identity as the Cereal City, a nickname it still uses, but the industry had consolidated into the handful of companies with enough capital, enough marketing sophistication, and enough product quality to survive the shakeout. The survivors were not necessarily the best products, they were the best businesses. The distinction, then as now, was everything. The breaking point between the Kellogg brothers came slowly and then all at once, the way most long-simmering family disasters tend to. W.K. had spent years in his brother's shadow, doing the operational work, managing the kitchen experiments, handling the commercial correspondence, watching the cereal they had developed together become a genuine commercial opportunity that John Harvey showed no interest in exploiting aggressively. When W.K. finally moved to commercialize cornflakes on his own in 1906, adding sugar to improve the taste and putting his own signature on the box, a signature that is, remarkably, still on Kellogg's boxes today, John Harvey was furious. He believed his brother was cheapening the health mission. He believed sugar would undermine everything the product stood for, and he sued. The lawsuit over the Kellogg name dragged through courts for years and was an extended public humiliation for both men. A cautionary tale about what happens when a shared invention becomes a commercial goldmine, and no one thought to write anything down. The legal dispute centered on a question that sounds simple and proved to be anything but. Who owned the Kellogg name in a commercial context? John Harvey had been using it on products sold through the Sands mail order operation. WK had been involved in those operations as a manager and contributor. Neither brother had formalized their agreement about who held what rights, if the commercial operation were ever separated from the institutional one, because the possibility of separation had not seriously been contemplated until the money became significant enough to make it worth fighting over. The court spent years working through the question of whether WK's use of the Kellogg name in his new commercial venture constituted an infringement on his brother's prior commercial use, or whether WK's operational contributions to the original products gave him rights that John Harvey's institutional framing did not extinguish. WK won. The decision confirmed his right to use the Kellogg name for commercial cereal products, and John Harvey was required to add the qualifier Kellogg's Sanitarium brand to his own products to distinguish them from his brothers. For a man of John Harvey's ego and convictions, this outcome, being distinguished from his own name, in his own field, by a brother he had employed for decades, was genuinely painful. The two men never fully reconciled. Their relationship, already strained by the years of unequal partnership, did not survive the legal battle intact, and the distance between them was maintained for the rest of their lives. What WK built after the lawsuit is one of the more straightforward commercial success stories of the early 20th century, which is to say it involved enormous amounts of money, very effective advertising, and a series of decisions that proved, in retrospect, to have been correct in almost every particular. He understood that national distribution required national advertising. He understood that taste was not a compromise of the health mission, but a precondition for reaching anyone beyond the existing health reform constituency. He understood, perhaps most importantly, that the signature on the box, his signature, his name in his handwriting, was not vanity. It was accountability. It was a legible human face on a mass-produced product, a gesture toward authenticity in a market that was already crowded with products making claims nobody could verify. The company he built is still one of the largest food corporations in the world. The signature is still on the box. John Harvey Kellogg, who outlived his brother, who continued writing and lecturing and running his various institutions into his 90s, died in 1943 having watched his name become synonymous with a category of food he spent the last decades of his life arguing was being done wrong. History tends to reward the person who understood the market. It is not always the more interesting person. The original flaked cereals were not sweet. They were not much of anything flavour-wise, which was the point. They were plain, they were gentle. They were, in Kellogg's vision, digestively neutral, morally uncompromising, and approximately as exciting to eat as damp cardboard. The move towards sweetness was gradual, and then, after the Second World War, extremely rapid. W.K. Kellogg's addition of a light sweetening to cornflakes was, by modern standards, extremely modest. But it established the principle that cereal could and should taste like something a person might voluntarily choose. Once that principle was established, the direction of travel was set. By the 1950s and 60s, the sugar content of children's cereals had climbed to percentages that would have caused John Harvey Kellogg to sit down quietly and reconsider everything he'd worked for. Frosted Flakes, Sugar Smacks, Cocoa Puffs, Cap'n Crunch. The entire second half of the 20th century's cereal aisle is the story of what happens when you start adding sugar to something and then keep going. The trajectory was not chaotic or accidental. It was driven by a set of market forces that interacted with each other in a way that, once you see it, seems almost inevitable. The first force was taste. Plain cereal competed against sweet alternatives at breakfast. Fruit, toast with jam, pastries, and sweetened cereal competed more effectively for the appetite of someone who was not deeply invested in the health reform tradition that had originally motivated the product. The second force was children. Children, unlike adults, do not approach breakfast with any pretense of nutritional idealism. They approach it with a preference for things that taste good, and things that taste good to children in the 1940s and 50s tended to be sweet things. The third force was television advertising, which arrived just as the children's cereal category was beginning to develop and provided a mechanism for reaching children directly before they were old enough to be skeptical and at exactly the age when brand loyalty forms most durably. The specific numbers that resulted from this convergence are striking even now. Some of the most popular children's cereals of the 1960s contained upward of 50% sugar by weight. This means that a bowl of cereal with milk was, calorically speaking, approximately as dessert-adjacent as a reasonable dessert, served at 7 in the morning by parents who'd been told by the box that it was fortified with 8 essential vitamins and minerals. The fortification was real. The vitamins were genuine. The framing of the product as a nutritious breakfast food was not technically false, in the same way that a chocolate bar with a calcium supplement is not technically calcium deficient. Both statements are true. Neither is the whole picture. What is remarkable about the sugar escalation is how completely it inverted the founding logic of the category. Breakfast cereal had been invented specifically as an alternative to stimulating, exciting, appetite-engaging food. It was supposed to be the boring option, the calm option, the option that asked nothing of your passions and required nothing of your willpower. Within 60 years of its invention, it had become, for millions of American children, the most exciting thing available before noon. John Harvey Kellogg, who believed bland food was morally necessary, had accidentally set in motion a process that would produce Fruit Loops. The distance between those 2 points, the Sands austere dining room and the grocery store cereal aisle in 1965, is one of the more remarkable journeys in the history of American food, and it happened one small increment of added sugar at a time. Sometime in the late 1940s, someone in the American cereal industry had a realization that would change marketing forever. Children do not make the final purchasing decision, but they absolutely influence it, and children will ask, repeatedly and at volume, for a cereal that has a friendly cartoon animal on the front. Tony the Tiger debuted in 1952, and he was not alone. Snap, Crackle and Pop had been around since the 30s. Cap'n Crunch sailed in during 1963. Lucky the Leprechaun materialized in 1964, guarding his Lucky Charms with an anxiety that, in retrospect, seems completely appropriate for a character whose entire existence is defined by having things stolen from him. The Trix Rabbit appeared in 1959 and spent the next several decades being thwarted, humiliated, and denied cereal by children, which was meant to be charming but which, if you watch the commercials as an adult, reads more like an extended study in frustration and systemic exclusion. The mascot era transformed cereal from a health food for anxious adults into a childhood institution, a Saturday morning ritual, a sugar delivery system with brand loyalty baked in at a remarkably young age. Tony the Tiger is worth pausing on because he represents a specific and very deliberate creative decision. He is not a cute animal. He is not friendly in the way a puppy is friendly. Tony is athletic, aspirational, and confident. He is a tiger who is telling you that the cereal is great, capital G, great, and he tells you this with the energy of someone who has genuinely thought about it and arrived at a considered position. He's not selling you something childish. He's selling you performance, achievement, the feeling of being the kind of person who starts the day powerfully. He is, in the vocabulary of a brand strategist, aspirational. He just happens to be striped and have an abnormally large head. The emotional logic of Tony the Tiger is not fundamentally different from the emotional logic of a sports drink commercial. It is simply aimed at a person who is 8 years old and eating breakfast in their pajamas. The leprechaun presents a different case study. Lucky, introduced with Lucky Charms in 1964, operates in a framework of scarcity and pursuit. Children are always trying to get his cereal. He's always trying to keep it. The product is positioned as something desirable enough to be guarded, rare enough to be worth pursuing. This is an elegant psychological mechanism for a food product. The suggestion that eating this cereal is a small daily victory, a capture of something that someone else would prefer you didn't have. It works on children because children understand, at a preconscious level, the pleasurable tension of wanting something and getting it. It worked on their parents because it was cheerful and harmless and associated the brand with a sense of playfulness that made the product feel wholesome even as the sugar content climbed. What the mascot era did, at the level of culture rather than marketing, was complete. The transformation of breakfast cereal from a medical proposition to an emotional one. It was no longer about your digestive health or your nervous system or your moral character. It was about which cartoon you liked, which character felt like yours, which box on the shelf was speaking directly to you at eye level in a voice you recognized. The breakfast table became a daily small negotiation between what parents thought was reasonable and what children had been told by a tiger and a rabbit and a leprechaun was the only acceptable option. Some things do not change much across decades. The negotiation at the breakfast table is one of them. Rice Krispies debuted in 1928, and its marketing genius was not a health claim, not a mascot in the traditional sense, not a promise of moral improvement or digestive relief. It was a sound. The observation that the cereal produced a distinctive crackling noise when milk was added became, in Kellogg's advertising, not a neutral sensory fact but an experience, something you could listen to, something almost animated, something that eventually became 3 small elf characters with an onomatopoeic social structure and a surprisingly long career in advertising. Snap appeared first on the box in 1933. Crackle and Pop joined him by 1939. The decision to name and personify a sound that a food makes is so odd and so specific that it becomes genuinely impressive in retrospect. Nobody had done this before. Nobody had looked at the noise their breakfast was making and thought, that noise deserves a name, a face, and a hat. Kellogg's did, and it worked. The sound itself has a physical explanation that is genuinely interesting once you know it. When you pour cold milk over Rice Krispies, the liquid enters the small air pockets inside each puffed grain. The grain's walls, which are rigid and slightly fragile from the puffing process, flex and in some cases fracture under the sudden temperature change and the pressure of the liquid. These tiny structural collapses produce the crackling sound. It is, in a technical sense, the sound of thousands of small grain walls breaking simultaneously, which is not the kind of description you put on the box, but which has a certain poetry if you think about it at the right angle. You are, every morning, listening to a tiny audible implosion in your bowl, and for nearly 100 years the commercial response to this has been to give it 3 names and put them in chefs' hats. The commercial decision to lead with sensory experience rather than health claims was significant for a reason that goes beyond this specific product. It acknowledged, implicitly, that the market had matured past the point where health anxiety was the primary driver of purchase decisions. for at least some segments of the consumer population. By 1928, cereal had been in American households for nearly 30 years. A generation had grown up eating it. For those consumers, the question was no longer whether cereal was healthy. That was already assumed, already internalized, already built into the category's identity. The question was which cereal was more appealing, more enjoyable, more interesting as a daily experience. Sound, it turned out, was a dimension of appeal that nobody had previously thought to compete on. The longevity of snap, crackle and pop as a marketing property is itself remarkable. They have been updated aesthetically across 9 decades, given different proportions and different hat styles and slightly different personality inflections as each era's visual language changed. But they have never been replaced, never been substantially reconceived, never been retired in favour of something more contemporary. This persistence says something about the specific nature of the asset. A sound cannot become outdated. The crackling of Rice Krispies in cold milk sounds exactly the same today as it did in 1928. Whatever you name, it is still there, still happening every morning in millions of bowls, and it is still, reliably, the most interesting thing that many people will hear before 8 o'clock in the morning. Cereal and milk feel so naturally paired that it's easy to forget the pairing had to be invented. The original granola of the 1860s was soaked in milk or water overnight, but this was about softening an extremely hard product rather than a flavour philosophy. The flaked cereals of the 1890s were softer and could be eaten dry, and many early adopters ate them that way. The recommendation to eat cereal with cold milk was partly practical. It added calories and protein to what was otherwise a fairly thin meal, and partly strategic. The dairy industry and the cereal industry were not formal partners, but they had interests that aligned almost perfectly. Milk made cereal into a more complete food. Cereal gave milk a daily use case at a time when refrigeration was inconsistent, and the morning milk delivery was a cold glass in search of a purpose. Together, they became one of the most successful food pairings in commercial history, which is extraordinary when you consider that nobody sat in a room and designed it that way. It just happened, gradually, until it seemed inevitable. The morning milk delivery of the late 19th and early 20th century was a specific logistics phenomenon that shaped American breakfast habits in ways that are easy to underestimate from the current vantage point of the refrigerator. Milk was delivered to the doorstep, typically before sunrise in glass bottles. It had to be used relatively quickly, particularly in warmer months, because mechanical refrigeration was not yet widely available in private homes. This meant that the morning delivery created a daily deadline of sorts. Here is fresh milk. Use it this morning, because by tomorrow it will be on its way to being something else. Cereal, which was conveniently already on the shelf, waiting shelf-stable, requiring no cooking, and only a bowl and a spoon, fit this window with a neatness that was commercially useful to both industries. It is worth noting that the cereal and milk pairing was culturally specific in ways that are still playing out. Lactose intolerance is significantly more common in populations of East Asian, African, Indigenous American, and some Mediterranean descent than in populations of Northern European descent, and the cereal industry's assumption of milk as the universal delivery mechanism for its products was built around a demographic baseline that excluded large portions of the global population. The rise of plant-based milks in the 21st century, oat milk, almond milk, soy milk, the entire alternative milk category, is partly a nutritional conversation and partly a long-delayed acknowledgement that the cereal and cow's milk pairing was never as universal as the industry's marketing had implied. The psychological hold of the pairing, though, is real and durable regardless of what you pour into the bowl. The sound of cereal hitting the bowl and milk following it is so deeply associated with morning, with the specific texture of the early day, with childhood and routine and the particular quality of light through a kitchen window before you are fully awake, that it functions almost as a sensory anchor. Marketers did not create this association. They found it, deepened it, and reflected it back in advertising until it felt like a natural law. Cereal requires milk the way coffee requires a mug, not technically, not chemically, but in the emotional grammar of daily life. That grammar was written gradually in millions of kitchens over 100 years. It is one of the quieter achievements of two industries that never formally agreed on anything. The health claims never really went away, they just changed shape. In the 1890s they were about digestion and moral character. By the 1940s they were about vitamins, as food manufacturers discovered that adding synthesized B vitamins and iron to cereal and then advertising the enrichment was both inexpensive and extremely persuasive. By the 1970s and 80s, fibre was the new frontier. An oat bran specifically became a cultural phenomenon so intense that people were eating bran muffins with the determined urgency of people who genuinely believed a muffin could save their life. The 90s brought antioxidants. The 2000s brought whole grains. The 2010s brought ancient grains, which are simply regular grains with a better publicist. The remarkable constant throughout all of this is that cereal has never, not for a single decade, been content to be just food. It has always been simultaneously food and argument, an edible position on health, virtue, and the correct way to begin a day. The vitamin fortification story of the 1940s is worth dwelling on, because it represents a genuine pivot in the industry's relationship with health claims, a shift from the speculative and emotional to the measurable and technical. During and after World War II, nutritional science had matured enough to identify specific vitamin deficiencies and their consequences. The government was interested in population nutrition for military readiness reasons. Food manufacturers recognized that adding small, inexpensive quantities of synthesized vitamins to their products and then advertising those additions was commercially valuable in a market where consumers were becoming nutritionally literate enough to respond to specific claims. 8 essential vitamins and minerals, 100% of your daily iron. The language on cereal boxes shifted from vague wellness promises to specific nutritional statements, and the specificity made the claims feel more credible even when the underlying product had not fundamentally changed. The oat bran moment of the late 1980s deserves its own acknowledgement as one of the more extraordinary episodes in American food culture. A series of studies suggested that soluble fibre, particularly the beta-glucan found in oat bran, could reduce LDL cholesterol and thereby reduce cardiovascular disease risk. The studies were legitimate, the findings were real, and the public response was completely disproportionate in the way that health scares and health enthusiasms both tend to be. Oat bran appeared in everything, not just cereal but muffins, bread, crackers, pasta, and at least one cookbook that attempted to incorporate it into desserts. Quaker Oats, which was positioned perfectly for this moment, saw its sales increase dramatically. The entire category leaned into fibre with an enthusiasm that, from the outside, looked less like a nutritional movement and more like a collective agreement that this specific thing, this fibre, was the answer everyone had been looking for. It was, as these things go, at least partly correct, which distinguished it from most of the other answers that had been offered since 1894. The pattern that emerges across these decades, the vitamins, the fibre, the antioxidants, the whole grains, the ancient grains, is one of genuine scientific progress combined with genuine commercial opportunism, and the two are almost impossible to cleanly separate. Each new nutritional finding became, within months of its publication, a marketing category. Each marketing category attracted products of wildly varying quality. all making claims calibrated to the findings' current cultural salience, and each cycle validated for the industry as a whole the founding insight of Kellogg and Post, that the person eating breakfast in the morning is looking for more than calories. They are looking for reassurance, and reassurance dressed in the language of whatever science is currently most trusted is what cereal has been selling in one form or another since the very beginning. There is no way to tell the full history of breakfast cereal and leave this out, even though it makes everyone slightly uncomfortable, which in retrospect might be exactly the reaction John Harvey Kellogg was hoping for. Kellogg's broader health philosophy included, as a significant and extensively published component, a conviction that what he called self-abuse was one of the primary causes of nervous disease, digestive disorder, and general physical deterioration in American men and boys. He wrote about this at great length, with clinical specificity, in several books. And as part of his dietary program, he advocated for foods that were bland, unstimulating, and low in meat protein, which he believed contributed to the problem. Whether cornflakes specifically were designed to address this issue is a matter of some historical debate. The direct causal claim has been somewhat exaggerated over time, but the broader connection between Kellogg's anti-stimulation philosophy and the blandness of his ideal diet is entirely real and thoroughly documented. The cereal in your cabinet is, in a genuinely documented historical sense, downstream of some extremely Victorian anxieties about the male body. Kellogg's writings on this subject were extensive, detailed, and delivered with the same earnest clinical authority he brought to everything else. His 1879 book, Plain Facts for Old and Young, contained passages that remained striking in their frankness about a subject that most Victorian-era writers addressed obliquely, if at all. Kellogg was not oblique. He catalogued, with the thoroughness of a man who'd made it his medical specialty, the symptoms he attributed to the habit in question: nervousness, poor memory, acne, stooped posture, love of solitude, and various digestive complaints, among many others. The list was long enough and general enough that it described essentially every adolescent who'd ever existed, which may have contributed to the theory's wide acceptance. The dietary connection was logical within Kellogg's framework, even if the framework itself does not hold up. He believed that the nervous system's excitability was directly influenced by the stimulating properties of food. Meat, spices, and rich foods heated the blood and excited the nerves, which in turn excited everything else. Plain foods, grains, vegetables, fruits had the opposite effect. They calmed, cooled, and quieted the system. A person eating a bland diet was, in physiological terms, less reactive to stimulation of all kinds. This was not a metaphor for Kellogg. It was a mechanism. The diet was the intervention. The grain was the medicine. The part of this story that tends to get lost in the jokes is that Kellogg's anxiety about sexual behaviour in young men was not isolated or eccentric. It was part of a broad Victorian cultural preoccupation with the management of male sexuality that ran through medicine, religious instruction, educational theory, and popular culture. He was not an outlier making unusual arguments in a vacuum. He was a prominent voice in a very active conversation. The specific dietary intervention he proposed was unusual. The underlying cultural anxiety was completely mainstream. This context does not make the theory correct, but it does make it comprehensible, and it does illuminate, once again, how thoroughly Kellogg believed that what you ate in the morning was a moral question with physical consequences, a conviction that shaped everything he built and everything that came after it, including the thing in your cabinet right now. The patients at the Battle Creek Sanitarium were, in a sense that was never quite made explicit to them, research subjects as much as they were guests. When Kellogg and his kitchen staff developed new grain preparations, They were tested on the patient population. The patients ate what they were given. There was no opt-in, no informed consent in the modern sense, no patient committee reviewing the experimental menu. You arrived at the SAN, you signed into the program, and you ate what Dr. Kellogg's kitchen produced because that was the treatment. This meant that the early history of ready-to-eat cereal is also a history of a captive audience. Wealthy, unwell people who came looking for relief from their dyspepsia and ended up beta testing a product that would eventually be eaten by the entire world. The feedback loop was direct. If patients found a preparation unpleasant, it was modified. If they ate it willingly and reported improvement, it was refined and potentially commercialized. The SAN was simultaneously a medical institution, a food laboratory, and a distribution test for products that would go on to make several people extremely rich. The ethical framework of the era was simply different from what would be required today, and it is worth being precise about that rather than applying contemporary standards to a 19th century context with the expectation that they should have been anticipated. Patients who checked into the SAN understood at a general level that they were submitting to an unconventional program under Kellogg's authority. The idea that this constituted informed consent for every specific dietary experiment conducted on the premises would not have been a concept Kellogg or his contemporaries would have recognized as a meaningful distinction. The physician directed the treatment. The patient accepted it. This was the operating assumption of medical authority in the 1880s and 90s, and it was not specific to Kellogg or to the SAN. What made the SAN situation unusual was the commercial dimension that developed alongside the medical one. The kitchen experiments were not purely therapeutic. They were also prospecting, an ongoing search for grain preparations that could be commercialized through the mail-order operation that Kellogg had established alongside the institutional one. When a patient ate something new in the dining room and found it acceptable, that acceptance had two values simultaneously: a therapeutic data point for Kellogg's medical program and a market research data point for the commercial operation. The patients were not informed of the second value. They had not agreed to participate in product development. They had paid to be healed, and they were also, as a byproduct, helping to build an industry. There is a particular irony in the demographic of the SAN's patient population, and the demographic that eventually became the mass market for the products developed there. The SAN's guests were wealthy, educated, health-conscious Americans who could afford the fees and the weeks away from their ordinary lives. They were the early adopters, the original consumers of these products, in an environment where consumption was compulsory. The mass market that W.K. Kellogg and C.W. Post eventually reached was considerably broader: working-class families, urban households without access to health institutions, children whose parents bought whatever was on the grocery shelf and affordable. The product travelled from one end of the economic spectrum to the other in less than 2 decades, which is a remarkable trajectory for something that started as a medical intervention in a controlled institutional environment and ended up in virtually every American kitchen, largely unmodified, accompanied by cold milk every morning before the day begins. By the early 20th century, the marketing of cereal began to shift, and one of the key shifts was toward women, specifically toward the idea that cereal represented freedom from the labour of cooking a full hot breakfast every morning. For a woman in 1910 or 1920 who was expected to rise before the rest of the household and produce a hot, substantial morning meal from raw ingredients, the promise of a food that simply required a bowl and a pour was not trivial. It was, in its modest way, a genuine reduction in morning labour. Cereal manufacturers were not feminist pioneers, they were selling product. But the framing of cereal as a time-saving, effort-saving, labour-reducing breakfast solution spoke directly to women who were doing an enormous amount of unpaid domestic work and were beginning, in that era, to have public conversations about what that work was costing them. The modern convenience food industry has its roots partly in this transaction, the exchange of domestic labour for purchased ease. The morning in a pre-convenience household was a project. If you were the woman of the house in 1910, you woke before your husband and children, started a fire or lit a gas burner, waited for it to reach temperature, made a decision about what there was to cook and what condition it was in, and then cooked it. Eggs, porridge, bread that needed toasting, meat that needed pan time, while simultaneously getting other people out of bed and approximately functional. This was not a romantic domestic scene. It was timed, physical, demanding work performed in the earliest and least forgiving hours of the day by someone who was expected to also perform every other domestic task between that moment and the end of the evening. The labour was invisible in the sense that it was not paid, not formally acknowledged, and not culturally recognised as skilled work, which did not change the fact that it took considerable time and skill and happened every single day without exception. Cereal advertising in the 1910s and 20s spoke to this reality with varying degrees of directness. Some ads were explicit about the time saved. Others were more atmospheric, showing women looking fresh and composed in morning kitchen scenes that implied, without stating, that their mornings were not the exhausting production you might expect. The image of the modern, efficient, organised household woman who'd found a smarter way to manage the morning routine was aspirational in exactly the way the Sans health claims had been aspirational a decade earlier. It was selling not just a product, but a version of yourself that you might become through the act of purchasing it. What is genuinely interesting about this framing, from a historical distance, is what it asked women to do with the time supposedly freed by cereal's convenience. The advertising did not suggest that the saved time belonged to the woman herself, for rest, for personal development, for anything unrelated to the household. The implicit suggestion was that efficient breakfast management freed up domestic capacity for other domestic tasks. You were not being liberated from the kitchen. You were being made more efficient within it. The liberation was real in the narrow sense. This specific task genuinely did take less time, and entirely bounded in the broader sense. It was the first iteration of a conversation about convenience food and domestic labour that is still, depending on who is having it, either fully resolved or not resolved at all. The transaction established a template that the food industry would return to repeatedly across the century. Sell a convenience product to women, frame the convenience as a form of freedom, and carefully avoid examining what that freedom was actually for. Cereal did it first, and it did it early enough that the template had time to become a convention before anyone thought to question the terms. The 1930s were not a decade of abundant breakfast options for most American families. Meat was expensive, eggs were rationed by budget. A hot-cooked breakfast took fuel, which cost money and time, which was increasingly consumed by the logistics of financial survival. Cereal, by contrast, was shelf-stable, relatively inexpensive, fast, and filling when eaten with milk. The Depression did not create the cereal habit in America, but it embedded it. Families who might have cooked eggs on a Tuesday in 1928 were eating cornflakes in 1932, and when the Depression ended and prosperity returned, the habit largely stayed. This is one of the ways cereal moved from being a product for health-conscious middle-class adults, the Sans demographic, to being a staple of the working-class American pantry. Economic necessity normalized it in households that might otherwise have resisted a product associated with sanitariums and dietary reform movements. The Depression changed American eating habits in ways that outlasted the Depression itself, and cereal was not the only food category that benefited from this dynamic. Canned goods, dried beans, bread stretched with cheaper flours, preserved and shelf-stable products of every kind became embedded in household routines during the 1930s and stayed there because habits formed under pressure are not easily dislodged when the pressure lifts. The human appetite for routine is strong in ordinary times. Under stress, when cognitive load is high and resources are scarce, routine becomes essential. Families who had reorganized their morning around a box of cereal and a bottle of milk from the doorstep did not reevaluate that routine when times improved. They simply continued it because it worked and because change required energy that prosperity does not automatically restore. The cereal companies navigated the Depression with varying degrees of success, and the ones that survived did so partly through pricing strategy and partly through advertising that was carefully calibrated to the emotional register of the era. Depression-era cereal advertising was not aspirational in the way that 1920s advertising had been. It did not sell efficiency or elegance or the modern household. It sold value, reliability and sufficiency, the quieter promises that resonate with people who are not thinking about optimization and are thinking about whether there will be enough. A box of cereal fed a family breakfast for a week at a cost that made alternative protein sources look extravagant. That arithmetic was simple and compelling, and the advertising said so plainly. There is a particular detail about Depression-era cereal consumption that tends to get overlooked, which is the role of the radio premium. Several cereal brands during the 1930s offered premiums redeemable by mail, small toys, decoder rings, booklets, badges, in exchange for box tops. These premiums were extraordinarily effective at building brand loyalty in households where children were the most enthusiastic consumers and box tops were a currency that cost nothing beyond the cereal you were already buying. The practice tied the product to a ritual of collecting, sending, waiting and receiving that had an emotional weight completely disproportionate to the physical value of the objects being sent. Children who mailed in their box tops during the Depression and received a small metal badge in return remembered that experience for the rest of their lives. The cereal company had purchased for the cost of a badge a loyalty that nothing in the competitive landscape could easily dislodge. It was, in its Depression-era context, a masterclass in understanding what people need when they don't have very much. If the Depression embedded cereal as a necessity, the post-war boom of the late 1940s and 1950s turned it into something closer to entertainment. Disposable income returned. Families were having children at historically high rates. Television arrived and delivered advertising directly into the living room. And the cereal industry looked at all of this and understood, with clarity that seems almost prescient in retrospect, that the future of the category was not in adult health anxiety, but in children's desire. The child-targeted cereal of the 1950s and 60s was a genuinely new kind of product. Not medicinal, not particularly nutritious, not apologizing for anything, designed entirely around the proposition that breakfast should be exciting. Color was added, marshmallows were added, chocolate was added. Shapes became animals, stars, clovers, letters of the alphabet. The cereal bowl went from being a site of earnest Victorian health intervention to being a daily small festival, and American children accepted this development with considerable enthusiasm. The post-war American household was a specific cultural and economic configuration that the cereal industry was built for, almost as if by design, though of course the timing was coincidence. The baby boom produced large families with many children and two parents, often with a father working, and a mother at home managing the household, including the morning routine. The children were growing up in a media environment defined by television, which they watched with an attentiveness and brand receptivity that advertisers found thrilling and parents found, in retrospect, somewhat alarming. The household had more disposable income than the Depression generation had possessed, enough to make product variety a viable consumer choice rather than an unaffordable luxury. Everything was in place for the children's cereal explosion, and the explosion duly happened. The specific products that emerged during this period were inventive in a way that is easy to undervalue because the results are so familiar. Lucky Charms, introduced in 1964, combined a toasted oat base with coloured marshmallow pieces, a combination that had no precedent in the history of food, was nutritionally improbable, and was immediately popular with every child who encountered it. The marshmallows did not soften the same way as the oats and cold milk, producing a bowl with two simultaneous textures, which sounds like a small detail, and was actually a significant part of the product's experiential appeal. The textural contrast was interesting in the way that a single texture food is not interesting. Interesting things hold attention. Held attention at the breakfast table meant slower eating, which meant more cereal consumed, which meant more boxes purchased. The product had been engineered to be eaten in a specific way, and the engineering worked. What the post-war children's cereal era produced, beyond the specific products and the mascots and the television commercials, was a generation of adults whose emotional relationship with breakfast cereal was formed in childhood and proved remarkably durable. The people who ate Sugar Smacks and Cap'n Crunch and Cocoa Puffs in the 1960s grew up, had their own children, and frequently continued buying those products or closely related ones, because the association between those specific cereals and Saturday morning and safety and pleasure was not a marketing artifact they could simply shed by becoming adults. It was wired in, early, deeply, and with the particular persistence of childhood sensory memories. The cereal industry had not just sold product to a generation, it had shaped the emotional architecture of how that generation thought about morning. That is a different kind of achievement, and a considerably more durable one. At some point in the 1950s, someone at a cereal company had an idea so simple and so effective that it became a defining feature of American childhood for generations. Put a toy in the box. Prizes hidden in cereal boxes became one of the most successful promotional mechanics in the history of packaged food. Children who might otherwise be indifferent to the specific brand of sweetened grain they were eating became intensely motivated brand advocates when the box contained a plastic decoder ring, a small rubber animal, a cut-out mask, or a coin. Parents bought cereal. Children demanded specific cereal. The cereal with the better prize won. The economics were, from the manufacturer's perspective, extremely favourable. A small injection-moulded plastic toy cost almost nothing. The resulting brand loyalty multiplied across a generation of children who associated a specific cereal box with the pleasurable anticipation of finding something at the bottom of the bag was worth an enormous amount. The cereal industry accidentally invented the loot box before video games got there by about 50 years. The mechanics of the inbox prize operated on a psychological principle that is both ancient and very well understood, which is the principle of variable reward. When you know a reward is coming, it produces a predictable and relatively modest level of anticipation. When you know a reward might be coming, or might be one of several possible rewards, or will be revealed only when you reach a certain point, the anticipation is considerably more intense. This is why gambling is compelling, why mystery boxes sell, and why children reaching into a cereal box with their arms submerged to the shoulder in toasted grain were experiencing something that felt genuinely exciting rather than merely pleasant. The toy was almost always small and cheap. The feeling of finding it was disproportionately large. The industry had discovered, without necessarily using this vocabulary, the hedonic power of the small surprise. The variety of prizes deployed over the decades was extraordinary in its range and its ambition. Early prizes were simple, small figures, paper items, badges. As the competition for children's attention intensified through the 1960s and 70s, the prizes escalated in both complexity and thematic tie-in. Cereal boxes contained records you could cut out and play, which presupposes a willingness to cut up your breakfast packaging, and a record player accessible to a child, both of which were apparently not unusual constraints. They contained model parts that accumulated across multiple boxes to build a larger object, which is a promotional mechanic of considerable audacity because it requires a child to convince their parent to buy multiple boxes of the same cereal in sequence, purely for the collectible value. They contained coupons, games, and in at least one memorable Kellogg's promotion from the 1950s, a genuine small submarine powered by baking powder that actually worked in a bathtub. The submarine required a box top and 10 cents. It was reportedly backlogged for months due to demand. A small baking powder submarine was, for a generation of children, more compelling than almost anything else available to them. The inbox prize eventually declined as regulatory pressure increased, as toy safety standards raised the cost of acceptable prizes, and as the entertainment landscape expanded enough that a small plastic ring could no longer compete for attention with video games and cable television. But its legacy is visible in every promotional mechanic that has followed it. The Happy Meal toy, the blind bag collectible, the digital loot box, the limited edition packaging. The cereal prize did not invent the concept of the surprise reward embedded in a commercial transaction, but it applied it, at scale, to an audience of children at the most receptive age, and it did so every morning at the breakfast table before the day had even started. The convergence of children's cereal and Saturday morning television in the United States created something that, if you grew up between roughly 1960 and 1990, was so normal it felt like a law of nature. You woke up early, you poured a large bowl of extremely colourful cereal, you sat in front of the television in your pyjamas, and you watched cartoons until someone made you stop. This ritual was not accidental. Cereal manufacturers were among the most significant sponsors of Saturday morning children's television programming. The commercials were integrated into the experience. The mascots appeared in the cartoons. The breakfast, the television, and the advertising were one continuous, mutually reinforcing system designed so seamlessly that it felt like spontaneous childhood joy rather than an extremely well-funded marketing apparatus. It was, to be clear, an extremely well-funded marketing apparatus, but it was also, for millions of people, genuinely one of the happiest memories of their early lives, and that is a complicated thing to hold. Saturday morning was a specific temporal territory in American childhood that existed because of a convergence of institutional arrangements that have since mostly dissolved. Children did not have school on Saturdays. Parents, exhausted by the working week, were frequently asleep for at least part of Saturday morning. The television was in the living room and could be operated by a child without adult assistance. Cartoon programming was scheduled from approximately 7 in the morning until noon, which is a 5-hour block of content aimed directly at children who were awake, unsupervised, and holding a bowl of cereal. The conditions were perfect, and the cereal industry understood this with the clarity of a group of people who'd been paying very close attention to when and how their target consumer was most receptive. The advertising that ran during Saturday morning cartoons was a different animal from the advertising that ran at other times. It was louder, faster, more colourful, and more emotionally direct than adult advertising because it was designed for a viewer whose attention was harder to hold and whose skepticism was less developed. The jingles were earworms engineered to replay in a child's head at the grocery store 3 days later when the parent was reaching for a box. The mascots moved and spoke and had personalities that were extensions of the cartoons they bracketed. The boundary between content and advertisement was, from a child's perspective, essentially non-existent. Tony the Tiger was as real as Bugs Bunny. The cereal commercial was as entertaining as the cartoon. This was not an accident. What the Saturday morning ritual produced at the level of culture rather than commerce, was a shared childhood experience that crossed class, geography, and family configuration in a way that very few cultural institutions managed. A child in rural Arkansas and a child in a New York apartment were watching the same cartoons, eating the same cereal, encountering the same mascots, and absorbing the same advertising in the same Saturday morning window. The specificity of the shared memory, the particular quality of early Saturday morning light, the cold cereal, the cartoon theme songs, the feeling of hours ahead with nothing required, is something that people who experienced it describe with a nostalgia that is almost painful in its precision. The cereal was a prop in a ritual that was genuinely meaningful. The industry that provided the prop did not create the meaningfulness, but it understood it, leaned into it, and made itself indispensable to an experience that a generation would spend the rest of their lives remembering as pure. In the late 1960s and into the 70s, something unusual happened. Granola, the original health food cereal invented at John Harvey Kellogg's Sanitarium in the 1800s, was rediscovered by the counterculture and transformed into a symbol of alternative living. The hippie movement's rejection of processed corporate artificial food led young people back toward whole grains, natural ingredients, and foods that felt honest. Granola, crunchy, oat-based, ideally with honey and dried fruit, became associated with back-to-the-land idealism, health food stores, and a general aesthetic of intentional simplicity. The irony, which is deep enough to swim in, is that granola was invented at a Victorian medical institution by a man who was one of the most controlling and paternalistic figures in American health history. The food that became a symbol of freedom and individual choice had its origins in a place where patients ate what they were given and didn't complain. History does not always go in the direction you expect. The counterculture's relationship with food in the late 1960s was genuinely ideological in a way that food preferences rarely are. The rejection of processed, packaged, brand-named food was not simply about nutrition. It was about refusing to participate in a corporate consumer culture that the movement identified as spiritually empty, politically complicit, and physically harmful. To eat natural food, food you grew yourself, or bought from a cooperative, or made from whole ingredients without industrial processing, was to opt out of a system that the counterculture found objectionable at almost every level. The food was a political statement. What you had for breakfast said something about what kind of person you were and what kind of world you believed in. Granola fit this framework with a neatness that was partly coincidental and partly a function of what it actually was. It was made from whole oats, which were unprocessed in a way that a cornflake was not. It was sweetened with honey rather than refined sugar, which carried associations of naturalness and agricultural directness. It could be made at home, in a kitchen, by someone who wanted to control exactly what went into it, which aligned with the movement's broader emphasis on self-sufficiency and disengagement from commercial food systems. It was also, importantly, genuinely good. Toasted oats and honey and dried fruit produce a flavour that is satisfying in a way that the original granola of the 1860s, which required overnight soaking and the willingness to eat something with the texture of wet gravel, had conspicuously failed to be. The commercial food industry watched the granola revival with the attentiveness it brought to all counterculture food trends, which is to say it waited approximately 18 months and then began producing commercial granola at industrial scale. By the mid-1970s, granola was available in every grocery store in multiple brands at a price that was higher than cornflakes, but not so high as to position it out of the mainstream market. The packaging was designed to evoke naturalness, earth tones, hand-drawn fonts, images of mountains and grain fields, while the product inside was manufactured with exactly the same industrial efficiency as every other packaged food on the shelf. The counterculture had rejected corporate food. Corporate food had absorbed the counterculture's aesthetic and sold it back to them in a bag. This transaction, repeated across food categories from yogurt to mineral water to artisan bread, is one of the defining dynamics of the late 20th century consumer food market. Granola was simply the first major cereal to go through it. From the 1970s onward, breakfast cereal found itself at the centre of an expanding, contentious, and sometimes bewildering series of nutritional debates. The food pyramid arrived, dietary guidelines were issued, research papers multiplied, and cereal, so simple in theory, just grain and flavouring, became a surprisingly complex site of scientific and political conflict. Fibre studies suggested that high-fibre cereals reduced cancer risk. Sugar studies suggested that high-sugar cereals were contributing to childhood obesity. Fortification debates asked whether adding synthetic vitamins to a nutritionally thin product made it genuinely healthy or technically defensible. The glycemic index became a framework within which some cereals were condemned and others celebrated. And through all of this, the cereal companies adapted with remarkable agility, reformulating, relabeling, and relaunching products to align with whatever the current nutritional consensus happened to be, then moving again when the consensus moved. The box of cereal in your cabinet has probably been redesigned at least twice in the last decade for reasons that have nothing to do with how it tastes. The food pyramid, introduced in its original form in 1992, placed grains at the base, the larger section, the foundation, the category from which the recommended 6 to 11 daily servings were supposed to come. Cereal companies responded to this with understandable enthusiasm, incorporating the pyramid into their packaging and advertising in ways that position their products as not merely acceptable breakfast choices, but as literally foundational to a healthy diet. The recommendation was, in the context of the science available at the time, defensible. In the context of subsequent research, which substantially revised the understanding of refined carbohydrates and their metabolic effects, it looks more complicated. The cereal industry had been given an official endorsement that it applied comprehensively, and that it was then required to quietly distance itself from as the nutritional science evolved. This is one of the reasons cereal box design changes so frequently. Each change is partly rebranding and partly an ongoing negotiation with whatever the current nutritional conversation happens to be saying. The sugar debate, which intensified from the 1990s onward and has not meaningfully resolved, placed children's cereal in a particularly difficult position. The products that had been most successful with children, the colourful ones, the sweet ones, the ones with marshmallows, were exactly the products that nutritional critics identified as most problematic. The manufacturers were caught between a consumer base, the children, who reliably preferred the sweeter products, and an influencer base, the parents and nutritionists and journalists, who were increasingly vocal about sugar content in foods marketed to children. The response was a series of reformulations that reduced sugar content modestly, while preserving as much of the flavour profile as possible, combined with front-of-box health claims that emphasise whatever nutritional positive could be credibly identified in the product. Whole grain was particularly useful in this regard. A cereal could contain a meaningful amount of whole grain and a substantial amount of sugar simultaneously, and the whole grain claim was technically accurate, even when the overall nutritional profile remained debatable. What the nutrition wars revealed about breakfast cereal more than any specific finding about fibre or sugar or glycemic response was the extent to which the product's identity had always been built on the claim of health rather than the reality of it. From Kellogg's auto-intoxication theory to Post's blood-building grape nuts, to the oat bran moment to the whole grain front-of-box stampede, Cereal had been promising health outcomes for its entire commercial existence. The science underneath those promises had varied enormously in quality and durability. The promise itself had never wavered. The product that was invented to cure dyspepsia was still, 130 years later, telling you it was good for you. The specific reasons had changed with every decade. The fundamental transaction had not. By the early 2000s, something had begun to shift in cereal sales figures that the industry found deeply uncomfortable, and by the 2010s it was unmistakable. Americans were eating less cereal. The reasons were multiple and arrived simultaneously, like a nutritional perfect storm. Millennials, it was reported in various slightly bemused news articles, weren't eating cereal because they didn't want to wash a bowl. This was widely mocked, but the underlying reality was more interesting. Younger consumers were eating differently in the morning, eating later, eating on the go, skipping breakfast entirely or reaching for foods, yogurt, protein bars, avocado toast, that felt more aligned with a different set of values. The Saturday morning cartoon ritual had ended as children's television fragmented across streaming services. The link between cereal, weekend leisure, and childhood joy was severing as the delivery mechanism for that joy changed. Sales of traditional cold cereal dropped year after year, and companies that had seemed immortal began to feel the pressure in their quarterly reports. The bowl-washing explanation, while reductive, pointed at something real about the generational shift in breakfast behavior. Millennials and the generations that followed them were living differently in the morning. The rise of smartphone use had restructured the first hour of the day for enormous numbers of people. The phone was the first thing reached for, and the phone's demands were incompatible with the quiet, relatively screen-free ritual of sitting with a bowl of cereal and a glass of juice before the day began. The morning had accelerated in a way that made even cereal, which had always positioned itself as quick, feel slow. A protein bar consumed in transit required no bowl, no milk, no table, no spoon, and no dedicated minute of stillness. Convenience had been redefined to a standard that cereal, despite its century-long association with the concept, could not meet. The decline of Saturday morning television was not a minor contributing factor. It was arguably the structural foundation of the children's cereal market, and when it went, it took the primary advertising delivery mechanism for a significant portion of the category with it. Children in the 21st century did not sit down at 7 on Saturday morning and watch a curated block of cartoons. They accessed content on demand, on tablets and phones and streaming services, at any time, in any amount, without the commercial interruptions that had made cereal mascots household figures for 3 decades. The advertising that had been delivered unavoidably into every American living room every Saturday morning for 30 years was now reaching a fragmented, opt-out capable audience that had no particular reason to sit through a 30-second cereal commercial when the next episode was one tap away. The industry's response to the decline was recognizable from previous cycles: reformulation, rebranding, product extensions into adjacent categories, marketing pivots toward adult consumers who had more complicated relationships with the product but more purchasing power, cereal bars, cereal-flavored snacks, cereals positioned as late-night snacks rather than breakfast foods, cereals marketed with craft food aesthetics. All of these were attempts to find new contexts for a product whose original context was shrinking. Some of them worked. None of them reversed the underlying trend. The category that had been invented to solve America's digestive crisis was now facing its own kind of crisis, one considerably more mundane than dyspepsia, but no less commercially serious. The simple problem of a culture that had changed around a product that had not changed enough with it. Somewhere around the 2010s, a predictable but still slightly surreal thing happened. Artisan cereal started appearing. Small batch, expensive, beautifully packaged, grain-based breakfast products began filling the shelves of specialty grocery stores and the feeds of food influencers. Ancient grains, sprouted oats, puffed amaranth, maple-sweetened clusters made in small batches in places with exposed brick walls. The price points were extraordinary: $12 for a bag of granola, $15 for a small box of grain-free clusters, and the marketing language would have been completely recognizable to C.W. Post, who was also selling grain products with extensive health claims and considerable confidence to people who were anxious about what they were putting in their bodies. The aesthetics had changed. The underlying transaction, sell an expensive grain product to a health-conscious consumer who was looking for more than just food, had not changed at all. John Harvey Kellogg, wherever he is, presumably nodded. The artisan cereal movement emerged from the same cultural conditions that produced artisan everything else in the 2010s, the craft beer movement, the small batch coffee culture, the farmers market renaissance, the general revaluation of made by hand, made in small quantities, made by a person you could, theoretically, meat as inherently more trustworthy and more valuable than made in a factory. This revaluation was partly a response to food safety concerns that had made industrial food production feel less safe than it once had. It was partly a response to the growing awareness of what industrial agriculture cost environmentally, and it was partly something simpler and less rational, the desire to feel, in a world of overwhelming scale and anonymity, that the thing you were eating in the morning had been made with attention by someone who cared about it. The artisan cereal brands that emerged in this period were sophisticated operations that understood marketing at a level that would have impressed C.W. Post. The packaging was exceptional, clean, beautiful, typographically considered, using materials and colours that communicated premium positioning without the garish energy of the children's cereal aisle they were deliberately not trying to occupy. The ingredient lists were written as narratives rather than technical specifications, not oats and honey, but organic whole-rolled oats from a specific farm in a named location, raw honey from hives managed by a beekeeper whose philosophy was described in 2 sentences on the back panel. The product was sold as a relationship, a story, a set of values made edible and placed in your kitchen for $15 a bag. What is fascinating about the artisan cereal moment, viewed from the vantage point of the full history, is how completely it recapitulated the founding logic of the category, while inverting its economics. Kellogg and Post had taken a product originally available only to wealthy patients at a medical institution and made it affordable and accessible to everyone. The artisan cereal brands took a product that had been universally affordable for a century and made it expensive and exclusive again, repositioning the price premium as a marker of quality, ethics, and discernment rather than simply of wealth. The Battle Creek Sanitarium's guests had paid a great deal of money to eat plain grain in a controlled institutional environment. The artisan cereal consumer was paying a great deal of money to eat beautifully packaged plain grain in their own kitchen. The grain was the same. The story around it had simply been rewritten for a new century, with a different set of anxieties and a different vocabulary for expressing them. Stand in the cereal aisle of any American grocery store right now, and you're standing in the accumulated residue of 130 years of health anxiety, food science, industrial capitalism, childhood marketing, agricultural policy, and one very opinionated Victorian doctor who believed your breakfast had moral implications. The flakes and puffs and clusters and O-shapes in front of you are the product of a patent dispute between brothers, an advertising arms race in a small Michigan town, a post-war baby boom, a Saturday morning cartoon block, several decades of conflicting nutritional science, and a granola revival that happened at least twice. The box you reach for, whatever you reach for, carries all of that with it. The cheerful mascot on the front is the descendant of a medical institution that didn't believe in sugar. The health claim on the side panel is the descendant of Post's breathless newspaper ads promising to cure loose appendix. And the act itself, pouring cold milk over processed grain in the minutes before you're fully awake, is something close to 100 million Americans do every single morning without giving it a second thought, which is, when you consider where it came from, one of the stranger quiet triumphs in the history of ordinary life. The cereal aisle is one of the few places in contemporary American life where you can see the full arc of the country's relationship with food laid out in front of you in a single commercial space. On one end of the shelf, the children's cereals, bright boxes, cartoon faces, front-of-pack claims about whole grain that sit alongside sugar contents that would have scandalized John Harvey Kellogg down to his sensible shoes. On the other end, the adult health cereals, muted packaging, clean ingredient lists, claims about fiber and protein, and ancient grains delivered in fonts that suggest serious purpose. In the middle, the classics, the cornflakes, the Raisin Bran, the Cheerios, products that have been on American breakfast tables for between 50 and 100 years and have survived every nutritional controversy, every market disruption, and every cultural shift by being above all familiar. Familiarity is a form of trust, and trust, in the breakfast aisle, is worth more than almost any other quality a product can have. What you are looking at, in that aisle, is also a complete portrait of the American health anxiety that produced it. Every product on those shelves is a response to some version of the same underlying question. What should I be putting in my body in the morning to be well, to be strong, to be the person I am trying to become? This question was being asked in 1894 by dyspeptic industrialists checking into a sanitarium in Michigan, and it is being asked right now by someone standing in a grocery store trying to decide between the oat bran clusters and the ancient grain muesli. The vocabulary has changed. The nutritional science has improved. The anxiety, the fundamental human wish to start the day correctly and eat in a way that reflects who you want to be, has not changed in the slightest. And in that persistence, in that unchanging human need to believe that breakfast means something, there is something almost touching about the whole strange story. A man with opinions about your digestion built an institution in Michigan. His brother got into a fight with him about sugar. A patient watched and went into competition. 40 companies opened in one town. A tiger was given a name. Marshmallows were added to oats. Children sat in front of televisions on Saturday mornings and ate things that would have horrified the men who invented the category. Granola was reclaimed by people who didn't know where it came from. The science shifted. The sales declined. The artisan version appeared at $15 a bag, and through all of it, every single morning someone poured milk over grain and called it breakfast. Not because a Victorian doctor told them to, not because a cartoon tiger told them to, but because it was quick and familiar, and the morning was waiting, and there was something quietly reassuring about a bowl that had been there your whole life, tasting more or less the same, asking nothing more complicated of you than a spoon. That is what your cereal bowl means. And it took 130 years, a lawsuit between brothers, and a very large amount of sugar to get here. And so here you are, lying in the dark, somewhere between awake and not, having just travelled from a Victorian sanitarium in Michigan to the Saturday morning living room of your childhood, to an artisan grocery shelf with a $15 bag of sprouted amaranth clusters on it. You've covered 130 years of grain, anxiety, ambition, and cold milk. You've met a man who believed your breakfast was a moral document. You've watched two brothers go to court over a flake. You've seen a rabbit denied cereal for 60 years running and never once stopped trying. Let's take a moment before you drift off to sit with what all of those people were actually doing. John Harvey Kellogg, for all his strangeness, for all the theories that have not survived contact with a century of better science, was genuinely trying to help people feel well in a time when feeling well was not something most people could take for granted. His methods were controlling, and his certainties were excessive, and his opinions about the body were, in several notable areas, spectacularly wrong. But the impulse underneath all of it, the conviction that what you ate mattered, that the body deserved attention and care, that breakfast was worth thinking about, that impulse was not wrong. It was just expressed by a man who had no ability to hold it lightly. W.K. Kellogg spent the first half of his life invisible, and the second half building something that outlasted everyone who had ever underestimated him. He put his signature on a box and never took it off. There is something quietly admirable about that kind of stubbornness. C.W. Poe sat in a sanitarium feeling terrible and came out the other side selling grain to the nation. He was not always honest, and he was not always careful, and some of his health claims were, to put it charitably, imaginative. But he understood something real about the human need for reassurance, and he spent his career trying to meet that need, which is not the worst thing a person can do with their time on Earth. And the people who ate the cereal, the patients at the SAN who chewed through the early experiments without being asked, the Depression-era families who ate cornflakes because it was what they could afford and it kept the morning moving, the children who sat in their pyjamas on Saturday mornings with a bowl of something improbably colourful and felt, in that specific combination of cartoon and sugar and early light, that the world was essentially good. Those people were not being fooled, not entirely. They were participating in something that, in its own strange and commercially motivated way, was trying to serve them. It did not always succeed. But it kept trying, which is more than you can say for a lot of things. Tonight, as you settle into the particular quiet of the very late hour, maybe let yourself feel something gentle toward the whole bizarre story. Toward the stale wheat that someone decided to run through a roller anyway. Toward the brother who wanted to add sugar and was right. Toward the tiger who's been enthusiastically endorsing the same cereal since 1952 with an energy that, honestly, deserves some respect. And toward the bowl in your cabinet right now, waiting for morning. Plain or sweet, cheap or expensive, cartoon on the front or clean minimalist label on the front, it has been waiting in one form or another for 130 years. It will be there when you wake up. The morning is not here yet. You don't have to think about any of it. Just let the day go quiet. Let the story settle. Let your body remember that it already knows how to rest, and that rest is the one thing no cereal has ever been able to improve upon, no matter how many vitamins they added. Sleep well.